Thanks, Michael. So hopefully everyone can hear me. So yes, as Michael said, I will take you through the principles. I'll try and go through these fairly rapidly. You can download the full principles. I think they may have been sent out in advance. They're all on the website in multiple languages. And just quickly, so this was a wide team drawn from around the world, from each of those key country partners, Brazil, India, and China. We were using lots of case studies and examples from those countries, as well as wider than that. And you have 4 of the 5 lead author team on this call, so we'll be happy to answer questions and get into discussions as we come to the end. But what I was going to do quickly is to go through each of those principles, so you get a sort of flavour of what each of them cover. And just a sort of quick introduction, I'm Ala Jones. I'm a director of the Global Sustainability Institute at Anglia Ruskin University. So these 10 principles, what we tried to do was to look at the general principles for policy making around energy, and in particular set this within the new context of a energy transition. So going from where we are now to a net zero future, then the traditional principles we use for energy systems may not be appropriate when you're looking at such radical change, when you're looking at trying to encourage innovation, growth in sectors, and a substantial shift away from the way business is done normally, into this sort of new paradigm and a very significant transition shift. So in doing that, we used 30 years of evidence, sort of empirical evidence, where policy has led to significant changes in renewable energy take-up or changes in transport systems, and using that evidence, try and build up a set of new principles, looking at where those traditional principles, the traditional way we look at how marginal changes in systems occur and what policies can be used to encourage those marginal changes, to look more at where these new principles encourage much more significant changes. So this isn't based on modeling or on there's some underlying theory behind each of these, but it's predominantly based on the empirical evidence of what has worked, and try to then highlight some particular case studies against each of the principles to show how that's worked in the past. So to go through each of the principles one by one, and then there's a summary of them at the end. The first principles is around technology choices need to be made. The traditional principle within policy has been policy should often be technology neutral. So this is where we're looking in the context of innovation and a structural change in the sector, that policies will always advantage a particular technology over another technology. And so it should be that decision or that influence should be made deliberately rather than accidentally. So it's to really consider what the actual impact of policies will be on technology, and which technologies are at an advantage and which ones are at a disadvantage, and to try and make that as a much more active choice going forward. Highlighting this case study is the one of UK offshore wind, where we've seen particular policy designs that benefit offshore wind, resulting in a significant reduction in the cost of offshore wind for the UK, a reduction of over a factor of 5 in the cost of electricity generation coming from offshore wind over a relatively short period of time, sort of over the last decade. So these sort of targeted policies can have a significant impact on the cost of electricity, the cost of generation, and the future cost of investment, as well as the growth of innovation and deployment in that sector. So the next principle is around invest and regulate to bring down costs. And this it counters the traditional principle around government interventions raise costs. So often we think of particular government intervention, whether that's through regulation or direct investment, increasing the cost of technology, in the private sector having a much bigger role in bringing those costs down. But often we've seen the evidence of specific government intervention bringing that cost down fairly rapidly. The case study we have here is in wind turbines, the deployment of wind turbines in Brazil, where again, the cost of onshore wind in Brazil saw a significant decrease around a factor of 4 over a slightly longer period, but over a 20-year period as a result of direct government intervention. The third principle is around actively managing risks to crowd in investment. And this is around governments stepping into actively managing risks, as opposed to the assumption that markets on their own optimally manage risks. So often we see that the charge towards government intervention is that it can crowd out private investment, whereas the evidence shows that when done properly or when designed well, government intervention, in particular government investment, can crowd in private sector investment, especially where that government investment or the regulation reduces technology risk or the perception of risk. Then co-investing or being a lead investor or investing in higher risk technology until they get to a stage where they're lower risk, then you can see a significant crowding in of investment. The case study for this one is around government investment via feed-in tariffs through internationally funded top-ups for small hydro in Uganda, which saw a significant increase in the rollout of small hydro in Uganda. As I said, each of these case studies will go into a lot more detail, and references for all of the data that goes into these case studies are in the main document, which is on the website. Next principle is around targeting tipping points. And this is opposed to the traditional principle around simply putting a price on carbon at a level that internalizes the damages of climate change. So this is important because when we're considering the rate of deployment of particular technologies, or the way we consider investments or regulation working together, they're very rarely linear, and often you need to look at policies when they are targeted at a particular technology. There's often a tipping point in when that technology becomes cost competitive, and policies can bring that cost competitiveness where private sector then just piles in investment slightly earlier. So the case study we had here was the electricity market reform in the UK, leading to a significant change in the way the UK investors approached renewable technology in the electricity generation, and a carbon price floor being a trigger to bring that tipping point forward a bit. So that carbon price floor acted not just, so the carbon price didn't need to be set at a incredibly high level to get that tipping point to occur earlier and to shift the technology over into that tipping point, so that private sector would then invest and scale up investment into renewables. The next principle is around combining policies for better outcomes. And this is contrasted with a traditional approach, which is around consider policies individually based on distinct market failures. So this isn't necessarily a sort of policy principle approach. It's more the way traditionally we've appraised policy. We often appraise them individually and then look at how they operate against a particular market failure. But often policies, especially when you're looking at a systems transition and the scale of the systems transition we're envisaging for a net zero transition, that scale means that policies have to act in tandem to work together to enable particularly large shifts in sectors. So it's true that policies do act as a greater than the sum of their parts. So you can't assess two individual policies separately and then get the same impact as if you would appraise them together. So the particular case study we looked at here was around the different policies that were supporting China's electric vehicle deployment, and again, a significant and exponentially growing market for electric vehicle, and the sorts of policies that you need to act in tandem and electric vehicle deployment. They're sort of obvious. You need infrastructure policies, you need investment in technology, research and development, and in manufacturing. So if you looked at just the manufacturing policies, but you didn't look at the infrastructure policy, then you'd get a very different view of the scale of the potential market that was possible for electric vehicles in the future. So bringing those assessments together means you can see this, or it's more likely you're going to see this exponential increase in market share when looking at policy appraisal. The next principle is around policies should be adaptive, and this is against the principle that policies should be optimal. So it's very difficult to consider policies when you're looking at such a rapid change or potentially rapid change, and in particular when you're looking at systems transition, to design a policy from the start which will be optimal throughout that transition. So we need to be able to take a more adaptive approach to policy and incorporate the adaptation of policies into their design. So whether that's clauses for changes in pricing levels as markets progress, or something that allows the policies to be adapted in a transparent and in a transparent way that's known in advance, so private sector can plan for the future, then that allows that policy to be much more effective, and it means you don't have to retrospectively change policies when they're seen to be less effective or too expensive. So the case study we have for this one is the expansion of solar PV in Brazil. Again, an exponential growth in solar PV in Brazil, and there were different times in Brazil where the policy had to change depending on how quickly the solar PV was being rolled out, and the cost of the policy back to the government, so to make it as optimal as possible throughout that transition, rather than just a sort of optimal design at the beginning. Next principle is around distributional issues, and this is around putting distributional issues at the centre. So this is important, and especially for a number of people and colleagues on this call. So traditionally, often we're using cost-benefit analysis for policy appraisal, and often that is framed in a way that says the policy is okay as long as the total benefits outweigh the costs. However, for all markets, and this was particularly highlighted for our the colleagues in Brazil, India, and China, that distributional issues had to be at the centre of policy analysis. Because they're important for a whole suite of policy outcomes, which are measured not just the technology deployment and the cost of a particular technology policy. This also has other potential co-benefits, as well as negative impacts on things like environmental, economic, and social goals. So thinking about the social goals in particular around distributional impacts, then that's really important. The case study we actually highlighted for this one was around the carbon road fuel tax in France. So this was more actually of a negative case study of how distributional issues were important in having to change policy once it's put in place, because they hadn't considered the full distributional impact and the response from the public to the distributional impact of a carbon road fuel tax done in the way it was. And obviously we saw the Gilets jaunes movement in France coming out as a result of the steep rises in road fuel cost as a result of that tax. So this also prevents having to change policies when the public find it difficult to absorb the costs, if that's what has been put in place. The next principle is around coordinating internationally to grow clean technology markets, and this goes against the traditional principle of looking simply to link carbon markets to minimize current costs. So this is around actually trying to coordinate beyond just carbon markets. So linking carbon markets is very important, and that obviously has huge benefits around trading, and it does help minimize current costs. But in terms of growing technology and whole sectors and facilitating this global energy system transition and reducing the overall global cost of the transition, then it goes beyond just linking carbon markets. It's around having more detailed conversations and strategies around manufacturing policy in China linked to consumption policy in the US. So can we think slightly more than just linking those markets, but thinking about the policies that will help to align and come in place in a timely way, where we're thinking about this transition, where you can get a much more coordinated global response that allows you to get the maximum benefit across the global market and the global supply chain into particular solutions. So the case study we had here was around international cooperation on zero emission vehicles, which you've seen, consumption policies around use of EVs across the European Union, across the US, and linked to manufacturing and production policies in China, in India and elsewhere, which allow this market to grow much more rapidly than they would if those policies weren't coordinated. The ninth principle, so almost there, is around assessing opportunities and risks. This links back to the first output from EEIST that was launched at COP26 that Michael referred to earlier, which sort of builds on the idea that we should go beyond assessing aggregate costs and benefits in our policy appraisal, policy development processes. So we need to be thinking more around the wider set of opportunities and risks, and potentially bringing in some more qualitative as well as quantitative measures to expand beyond cost benefit. And the cost benefit analysis can be considered as a specific example of this risk opportunity approach, where marginal change is more appropriate. So the risk opportunity analysis takes that up one level and allows you to bring in different considerations in the appraisal process. There's lots of examples and a lot more detail in that first report from EEIST, but in this particular report, we highlighted the India's transformation for LED demand aggregation through public procurement and the sorts of choices that they went through there and the wider opportunities and risks that they considered in that transition. Finally, the last principle, so principle number 10, is around knowing your biases, and that counters the traditional principle around policies and models and assessment are always neutral. And this is linked to lots of discussions we've had with policymakers and think tanks and modelers around, in particular in the European Union, looking at the construction of economic models and policy advice, and acknowledging that energy models have some underlying ideology or theory that informs their choices. The data you use informs the boundaries in which you can then apply your models. So it's being open and transparent about what the model is useful for and what it's not useful for. So what is the limitation of the actual approach you're using in assessing policy? So some models are more appropriate for different policy appraisals. Often it's useful to apply multiple models or appraisal processes to a particular policy, just to make sure that you're understanding the full range of potential outputs and potential outcomes from a policy. So the case study we looked at there was the European 2030 renewable energy targets, which did use a number of different policies, but went through different iterations where one policy said one thing, and there were political reasons for looking at particular outcomes, but also the questions set by the policymakers were defined and put a boundary on what the models could look at. And then when those boundaries were loosened, more models could look at it and you got slightly different answers. So it's important to consider the political nature of any policy appraisal system, which is true for all of the policy principles in the that we've put out here in the other 9. So those are the 10 principles in summary. And as I said, there's a lot more detail in the report, and hopefully we've got time to go into discussion and questions.